I want to talk to you guys about my problems with the pro-Palestine movement and also my problems with the pro-Israel movement. Both of these movements have their dysfunction. Both of these movements have their weirdities and just their evils, I should say. There is evil in both of these movements, and I think that this is where a lot of the misconception about what I have said comes from. The problem with a lot of people, and I want to say most people, but I want to be more charitable than that. The problem with a lot of people is that they have this all or nothing attitude when it comes to talking about very, very polarizing issues. So if you have Russia versus Ukraine, you have people who come along and they say Russia is perfect, Russia can do no wrong, Russia just is a nation where the rainbow springs up into the sky and they are just exempt from criticism. And those types of people, not all of them, but a lot of them will get into this pro-Stalin sort of thing where they'll start saying things like, oh yes, Stalin actually wasn't a mass murderer. The Soviet Union actually didn't kill millions of people. Soviet Union was great. Stalin was amazing. Glorious Stalin, blah, blah, blah. And then you have people who are extremely pro-Ukraine to the point where Ukraine can do no wrong and Ukraine is just this righteous nation. It has done no evil whatsoever. No terrible things have been done by Ukrainian paramilitaries or Ukrainian soldiers. And those people are so insane that it comes to the point where you can show them a video of Ukrainians literally burying a man alive, and they will say that the video is fake. So you have these insane mentalities, and you have this insane way of thinking where once somebody chooses a side, they can't really accept the criticism towards the side that they have chosen. And if I come along and I say, here are my problems with the Palestinian movement, people will say, oh, look, Ted is pro-Israel, he's a Zionist, etc., etc., he's a shill for the Jews, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then if I come out one day and say, hey, here are my problems with the state of Israel, here are my problems with the Israeli government, etc., etc., people will say, well, I thought you were pro-Israel, I thought you were like some crazy Zionist, blah, blah, blah. What happened? Did you change your mind? Are you a grifter? Are you a shill? Blah, blah, blah. And the problem with these people is that for some reason they cannot fathom the reality that both sides have their problems, and both sides, just like any other side, are not exempt from criticism. And both sides deserve criticism. Both sides do. And if you look at the Palestinian side, you will see a lot to criticize, and you will see a lot of problems. And this is the reason why my dad left the pro-Palestine movement. My dad was an activist for Palestine back in the 70s, back in the 1980s. My dad was an activist for Palestine. My father was a member of the PLO at one point in time, and he left all of that stuff because he said that it was full of lunatics. And it is. Even today, it's full of lunatics. In fact, the pro-Palestine lunacy is at its peak level. It is at peak levels of lunacy. I haven't seen the pro-Palestine movement get as big as it is right now. It's quite surreal. And I think that it's going to continue on this way. And eventually it's going to escalate into something absolutely atrocious, especially against against both the Arabs and the Jews. Anyway, if you look at the pro-Palestine side, the biggest problem with the pro-Palestine side is that they will go on and on about how Israel is evil, Israel is genocidal, racist, etc., etc., and they will point to legitimate criticism. They will bring up legitimate points. They will bring up certain actions done by the Israeli government that are worthy of condemnation and criticism. They will bring up certain actions that have been done in the past or done today by Israel, and these actions are atrocious. They really are. But when you bring up the big question, of What do you think of October the 7th? What do you think about what happened on October the 7th, in which Hamas and other terrorists and hooligans from Gaza just raided Israel, and they raped and murdered and pillaged? And instead of saying, that's terrible what happened, a lot of these people, not all of them, not all of them, but a lot of these people will sit there and make excuses for what Hamas did. Or they will just flat out refuse to condemn Hamas. And we have seen this numerous times. We have seen people try to deny that atrocities were done on October the 7th. And it's all just complete lunacy. What spurred me to do this video was a debate that I saw between Abby Martin and this Israeli woman who is a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Her last name is Schrader. I'll just call her Ms. Schrader because actually her name is, I have it right here, Emily Schrader. Emily Schrader is a pro-Israel activist who is extremely outspoken about her support for Israel. Abby Martin is an activist who has been around for a long time. She was working for Russian television for a while. She has worked on a number of documentaries against the U.S. media empire, but also against the state of Israel. She's been around for a long time. She was on the Joe Rogan podcast a number of years ago to talk about how Israel is terrible, et cetera, et cetera. So here is Abby Martin, pro-Palestine, versus Emily Schrader, pro-Israel. And they're going back and forth. And this was on the Piers Morgan show. And Piers Morgan brought up the question that he brings up every single time he is moderating a debate on the Israeli-Gaza war. Do you condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th? And this question has been asked by Piers Morgan so many times that it has become a meme. It has become a big meme, especially in his comments section. People will say, the world will go through a nuclear holocaust, and Piers Morgan will be asking, do you condemn October the 7th? Something like that. People make fun of him for this, and they'll say that it's redundant. They will say that it is redundant for Piers Morgan to continuously ask this question. But it's not redundant. It is actually extremely pertinent, and it's relevant to the discussion, because if you are going to criticize Israel for killing civilians, well, then surely you should have no issue condemning Hamas for also killing civilians. And if you do not have an issue with Hamas killing civilians, well, that means that your criticism of Israel is not really based on humanity and compassion. It's really just based on some sort of crazy bias. Well, Abby Martin was confronted with the infamous October the 7th question, the infamous 10-7 question. And she, like so many others, failed the test and made herself look terrible because she refused to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th. She refused. She completely refused to condemn it. And she even said something to the likes of, I will not participate in this obligatory condemnation of Hamas. And it makes her look awful for obvious reasons, because what Hamas did was mass murder. There was rape, there was murder, there was pillaging, and she refuses to condemn Hamas. So your condemnation of Israel for killing civilians has nothing to do with compassion or humanity or empathy. It has something to do with some sort of weird bias, some sort of very, very bizarre double standard. And this is my biggest problem with the pro-Palestine movement. If people would just say, this is wrong, this is right, this is also wrong, this is also right, the world would be so much more balanced. So much more balanced if people would just make that observation. You have to call evil for what it is, and you also have to call good for what it is. But if you are going to just sit there and make excuses for your side because that's your political football team, well, that just reveals a very, very insidious and cynical double standard. And we have seen this so many times. And the problem with a lot of people is that if they see somebody saying nice things about Israel, they think, oh, this guy's pro-Israel. And all the pro-Israel people come out and they say, oh, this guy's our guy. He's one of our guys. But once that particular person begins to criticize Israel for whatever reason, the pro-Israel people come out and they say, well, I thought you were pro-Israel. Well, what got you to change your mind all of a sudden? And what they refuse to see, and for some reason what they cannot fathom, is that this particular person is simply being balanced. This person is being balanced. Israel has done terrible things. Israel does human rights violations. This is undeniable. Hamas does atrocious human rights violations as well. But Hamas is obviously worse than, I would say Hamas is worse than Israel in the sense that I can go to Israel and I can find numerous organizations that are critical of the state of Israel. I can find numerous organizations that are against racism against Palestinians. I can talk to Israelis who can acknowledge that there are problems with racism within Israeli society. But if I go to the Palestinian society, how many people will I find who are critical of the dysfunction within Palestinian culture? How many people can I find who are critical of racism or critical of anti-Jewish sentiment within Palestinian society? I'm sure they exist, but you can probably count them on your hands. It's extremely difficult to find Palestinians who are critical of the evils that are done within their own society. I can go into the West Bank or into Gaza, and will I find any organizations that are critical of Hamas? You won't find them. So the reason why you have these differences is because within the Palestinian society, you have an Islamic fundamentalist culture, and it's extremely dysfunctional and it's extremely evil. And that is, for the Palestinian culture, that is at the core of the problems within that particular society, within that particular demographic. But that does not mean that Israel has not done terrible things. What I'm simply pointing out in this case is that in Israel, I can find people who are willing to come out and say Israel has done terrible things. Now, you can say, well, it's because Gaza is under a tyrannical organization called Hamas. Okay, fine. But why is it that you can go to New York City or you can go to Chicago and meet with pro-Palestine activists, and those activists will refuse to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th? And those people aren't under Hamas. So this is more of a cultural and religious problem than anything else. Now, the problem with the pro-Israel side is that when you bring up terrible things that have been done by the Israeli government, a lot of people who are pro-Israel will deny it, or they will shrug it off, or they will try to justify it. And I've seen this numerous times. The biggest example that I can think of is the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The Sabra and Shatila massacre took place in the, I want to say, the early 1980s, and it was a massacre that was done by a proxy paramilitary organization called the Kataib. And the reason why I say it was a proxy was because they were backed by the Israeli government. There was a horrific civil war that broke out in Lebanon, and it took place in the 1970s, and it went into it continued on into the 1980s, and it really didn't end until the 1990s. So it was a decades-long civil war that happened within Lebanon, extremely bloody, tons of people were killed, and in the early 1980s, there was a peace treaty that was agreed upon between the Kataib, backed by Israel. And by the way, the Kataib were not Muslim. The Kataib were Lebanese Catholics who were a part of the Lebanese Maronite Catholic Church. The Lebanese Catholic Church is called the Maronite Church. And they were an extremely racist organization. They're still around. There's still plenty of Lebanese people who are Kataib, or they're pro-Kataib. They sympathize with the Falungist movement. And you can even find Lebanese Catholics in America who are a part of this way of thinking. It's extremely insidious. I have seen it myself. And they are extremely racist against Palestinians, to the point where they can be just as evil as skinheads or neo-Nazis. And in the early 1980s, there was an agreement between the Kataib and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the agreement was that the PLO would leave the Palestinian refugee camps, the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And the PLO honored their agreement and they left the refugee camps. The Kataib, or the Phalangist, agreed that they would not harm civilians, that they would not harm the civilian population. The PLO honored their part of the agreement. They left. But the Phalangist did not honor their agreement. They were covenant breakers. They were oath breakers. And once the PLO was gone, that left the entire civilian population completely vulnerable to being butchered and massacred. And that's exactly what happened. Around 1,000 to 3,000 Palestinians. I mean, the number of Palestinians who were killed is disputed, but from what I've read, it was anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 Palestinians were butchered. Regardless of the number that you choose, it was a lot of people. And the bloodbath went on for about 3 days. So 3 days of mass butchery and rape. And the most horrifying thing that I can remember from reading about the Sabra and Shatila massacre was the fact that people were forced to watch their family members being butchered. And people were butchered by axes, knives. There was one story I remember reading where a little girl had this earring on her ear, little Palestinian girl, and this Lebanese racist said, "Is that a golden earring?" And she said, "No, it's not gold." And he said, "You're a liar." And he grabbed the earring and he tore it from her earlobe before shooting her and murdering her. I mean, it's just so horrific, and so many horrific things happened in that massacre. Well, that massacre was completely done with the oversight of the Israeli government. The Israeli government watched this massacre take place. They had Israeli soldiers surrounding the camp to make sure that people didn't run away. The Israeli government absolutely watched as it happened, and they facilitated the butchery. And it was a completely obvious war crime. It was an absolute war crime that was done by the Israeli government. And I'm someone who has been sympathetic to Israel for my whole life. But that was terrible. Now, when I read about atrocities that have been done by Palestinians, I will say that is terrible. And we can say what happened. We can talk about what happened before the Sabra and Shatila massacre. We can say, well, the PLO did terrible things. And the PLO did terrible things. That's absolutely right. The PLO did terrible things. But that does not make what happened in Sabra and Shatila justified. And this is the problem. A lot of people look for justifications for evil. They will say, well, Sabra and Shatila happened because the PLO did this, that. October the 7th happened because the Israeli government did such and such an action that was bad, supposedly. And they're always looking for a justification to do evil. And this is my problem with both the pro-Israel side and the pro-Palestine side. Here is the way I look at the war between Hamas and Israel. This is the way I look at it. And this is the reason why I will criticize both sides. Here's the reason why. It is an evil government destroying another evil government. It is one evil society, and the Israeli society is, to a great extent, evil. And I'll explain that in a little bit here. It is one evil society destroying another evil society. It's clay crushing clay. And that's why I will criticize both. The Israeli society, to a great extent, is extremely corrupt. Israel is a very corrupt country. The Israeli society is extremely accepting and tolerant towards Sodom. It is one of the, if not the most pro-Sodom nation on the face of the earth, which goes back to the book of Revelation, where you have St. John saying Jerusalem, where our Lord was crucified. And then he, before that, I believe he describes Jerusalem as being Egypt and Sodom. Israel is a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. You cannot preach Jesus in Israel without the risk of being horrendously assaulted. I saw a video recently of a Korean woman preaching the gospel in Israel, in Jerusalem, I believe. And she's at a bus stop telling people about Jesus, and some Jewish fanatic bashes her head with a backpack. And I'm not talking about just a light hit, I'm talking about severely bashing her head. I saw another video of a woman, also Korean, who was preaching Jesus, and some fanatic grabs her and slams her on the ground and gives her a spinal fracture. I saw another video of a Christian woman preaching, and some rabbi comes. I'm assuming the guy's a rabbi, but he's definitely a religious Jewish person. He comes along and just smacks this woman right in the face, and no one gives a damn. And you see this sort of thing. I have seen racism in the Israeli society. I've read about racism in the Israeli society. It does 100% exist. You have fanatical, racist, far-right, anti-Christian political parties who have become significantly popular at a scary level in Israeli society. Israeli society is an evil society. Now, not everyone is evil there, but to a great extent, there is a lot of evil there. Gazan society also has a lot of evil. People are pro-Hamas, obviously pro-terrorism. They don't mind the fact that Hamas will go out and kill Jewish people. A lot of people in Gaza don't have an issue with murdering Jews. A lot of people in Palestinian society sympathize with Adolf Hitler. So all these things are dysfunction. The way I look at it is this is one evil government destroying another evil government. So I can acknowledge the evil of both sides, which means that I can criticize, and I will criticize, both sides. Bottom line. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.